Call this one first project. And up here are some project settings. Now I'm going to leave it at blueprint since we're not going to be going over C++ coding in this video. And down here, I want to make sure starter content is enabled. Starter content will give us some nice assets that we can play with to help us learn Unreal Engine 5. Below that is ray tracing. We're not going to go over ray tracing just yet. And of course, to create this project, let's click on create. So this is what you should see when opening up Unreal Engine for the first time. Don't worry, we're going to go over what all these different windows and buttons do in just a second. But before that, I want to go over how Unreal Engine stores projects. So let's exit out of this project, and we can see that a brand new folder was created on our desktop. Remember, I selected my desktop as the place to save our project. Essentially, this folder contains all the data that makes up our project. So whenever we make a change in our project or we create something in the project, it's going to be stored right here. Now to open up our project again, all you have to do is double click on the .u project asset right there. And that will open up your project from where you last saved it. To begin, let's briefly go over how to navigate the user interface and what all these different windows do. So probably the window that sticks out the most is the viewport right here. The viewport is essentially just a view into our 3D world that we're creating. So for example, we can fly around and look at our world. We can even grab objects and manipulate them all within the 3D viewport. Now, don't worry, we are going to go over camera controls and how to move objects in just a bit, but I first want to go over what the different windows do. Right above the viewport is the toolbar. The toolbar is pretty important because it's where we get a lot of our tools and a lot of different buttons we're going to be continually pressing. For example, what if I want to add an object into our world? Then I can click on the plus icon and scroll down to shapes, and maybe I add in a sphere. And place it in the world to move it around. I can also switch modes. So right now I'm in select mode, which is the main mode where we can move objects around. Let's say if I'm making a landscape, I can go into landscaping mode and create a landscape. Or I can go into foliage mode and start to paint foliage if I do have those assets. If you are curious, we are going to go over both modes later in the video. Now to the right of that, we have the outliner. The outliner is essentially a list of all the objects that make up my current world. So for example, if I want to select a chair, but the chair isn't in my view right now, within the outliner, I can select a chair right there like that. I can also select multiple objects by hold down control. So maybe I want to select both chairs, just hold down control like that, and maybe also the statue right there. The outliner is also a great place to organize your world. For example, we see we have all these folders. Real quickly, if you want to create a folder, all you have to do is right click, create folder. Let's call this one my folder, and hold down control. Let's select both chairs and simply drag them into there just like this. We can also hide and unhide objects. For example, maybe I want to edit something that's behind the table, but the table's in the way right now. I can come here and temporarily click on the eye icon to hide the table, and then click on the eye icon again to unhide it. And right below the world outliner, we have the details panel. The details panel is essentially where we can edit all the properties of an object that we have selected. For example, maybe if I don't like the scale of this chair right here, I can select the chair and come to scale and maybe increase it by 2 in the Z axis, which is the vertical axis, and see that we have a really long and tall chair. Now, I don't like that edit. It looks kind of weird. So you can always press Ctrl and Z in Unreal Engine to undo anything. Now, we do have one more default window. That's arguably the most important window since it stores everything we're doing. It stores information on the chairs, the table, even the entire world. And that is the content drawer. You get the content drawer by going all the way down here to the bottom left-hand corner and clicking on content drawer like that to bring it up. Alternatively, since this window is pretty important, you can press Ctrl and space at the same time. Alternatively, down here to the bottom left-hand, and that is the content drawer. You get the content drawer by going all the way down here to the bottom left-hand corner and clicking on content drawer like that to bring it up. Alternatively, since this window is pretty important, you can press Ctrl and space at the same time to bring it up and close it. So if you press Ctrl and space, it's going to bring up the content drawer, and this gives us a folder view of all the assets that make up our project. So for example, if we want to see where this chair is being stored and maybe we want to edit the chair, Then we can come under starter content, props, and right there we have SM_chair. If I double click on it, we can see the chair asset and make any adjustments if we do need to. Now we're going to go over the static mesh editor later, so I can exit out of this window by clicking on the X icon. I'm going to press Control and Space again to bring back my content drawer. And probably the best example I have for the content drawer is that it's like your computer's file explorer. So just like on your computer where you have folders, and in those folders you have subfolders, and those subfolders contain assets like text files or Word documents, same exact thing with the content drawer in Unreal. So you have folders, and in those folders you have subfolders, and finally you have all those assets that make up your project. So for example, here we have the starter content folder, and I can go into it by double clicking like this, or I can click on it right here within the folder window. Now I could go into any of these different folders. For example, the maps folder contains the map we're currently editing. So we can see up here that this map is called minimal_default. Right there's minimal_default. We can double check that we are editing this map by double clicking on it to open it up. Let's go save. And we can see that it did open up the exact same map. Now, if I ever want to go up a folder, I can always click on here. So right now we're in the maps folder. If I want to get out of that, I can click on starter content. And if I want to get out of that, we can even go to content right there. Now, don't worry, if you don't have starter content, you can click on add and then add feature or content pack, and then go to content and simply select starter content and add a project. I'm not going to do that since we did add it when we were creating our project. As you can guess, the content drawer is a pretty big deal, and maybe you don't want to press Control and Space all the time to bring it up. You always want it docked in your layout. Well, all you have to do is click on docked in layout like this, and now your content drawer will be right here at the bottom. And notice how it's called content browser right now, not called content drawer. So whenever I say content browser and content drawer, just know that I'm talking about the same exact thing. Now, this is great, but this tab right here is taking up a little bit of real estate. If you ever want to get rid of a tab, all you have to do is right click and click on hide tabs. If you want to get back that tab, then you can click on the very small blue triangle and that will bring back your tab. Also, tabs are great because if you left mouse button and hold, you're able to move this around and dock it somewhere else. So maybe if I don't want content browser at the bottom right here, I can dock it to the side, or I can even dock it to one of the tabs right here. And now I'm able to switch in between details and the content browser. Also, if you ever want to move windows around, you can hover in between the windows, and then you're able to move it down just like this to adjust exactly how you want your user interface. Now, another neat trick is that if I dock my content browser right here, and let's go make it a little bit smaller, and maybe I don't want it always visible, I can right click and go dock to sidebar. Now, whenever I want my content browser or any other window, I can just click right here and it will show. Now, if I don't want to dock to sidebar, I can right click and unlock from sidebar just like that. Now I'm going to click on the X icon to get rid of that content browser. Alternatively, if I want to automatically dock all my windows in a sidebar except the viewport, I can click on F10, which will go into full screen mode. And now we can see that my outliner and details window and any other windows I have on the side will go into docked mode. And then I can click on F10 again to bring those windows back. So F10 is a neat shortcut to automatically dock all your windows. Now, these are just the default windows. If you want to see all the windows that are available to us, we can come up to Windows and select any of these. Now, one window that we are going to be using a lot is the world settings. So world settings, as you can guess, just has a bunch of different properties and settings that we can play with to edit the map we currently have opened. Now, for example, what if we really mess up our user interface? It's basically unreadable. We have no idea what is happening. Don't worry, we can always come up to Window and all the way down here, go to Load Layout and click on Default Editor Layout, which will just reset all of our windows. Now that we have the very basics of the user interface out of the way, we can move on to the fun stuff, and that is camera navigation. So how to navigate our camera around our 3D world so we can view it at all different angles. To navigate is actually easier than you think. So you want your cursor inside the viewport, and then you want to hold down the right mouse button. If you now move your mouse with the right mouse button held down, you're able to look around your scene. And still, with the right mouse button held down, you're able to use the WASD keys to move around. You can also use E and Q to go up and down. So that's E to go up, Q to go down, W to move forward, S to move backwards, and A and D to move left and right, all the while holding down the right mouse button. If you are not holding down the right mouse button and you try to use WASD, then nothing will happen. So make sure you do hold that down. Now we can also control our camera speed. So let's say, for example, there's an object that's really far away and you want to go towards that object, but your camera is moving too slow. Well, if you come up here to the top right-hand corner and select the camera icon, you're now able to control that speed. So right now we're at 4. We can also bring this up to 6, and now we are a lot faster. And we can bring this all the way down to 1, and we can see that we are pretty slow. So let's leave it at 4. And a shortcut to access camera speed is to, of course, hold down the right mouse button and use the scroll wheel. So scroll wheel up will move faster, and scroll wheel down will move slower. So that's a shortcut. That's how you don't have to come up here and continually play with the camera speed if you do want to move faster or slower. Here's a really good tip. Let's say if you scroll really far away, so you fly really far away from where the bulk of your geometry, where your world is, and then you look around and you can't find your objects anymore. What you can do is come up to any of the objects right here. Let's say, for example, the chair, select that, and then press the F key to focus on that object. So if you select an object, you can press F to then snap to that object, just like this. So that's how you're never lost in your world. So if you ever played any first-person games, you should be right at home since the muscle memory is there for the WASD keys and rotating your camera by moving your mouse. Now, if we press F again to then zoom in onto an object, we can rotate around that object by holding down Alt and the left mouse button. So Alt and left mouse button allows us to rotate around a pivot object. And if we hold down Alt and hold down the right mouse button, we can zoom in and out. So right mouse button, zoom in and out, left mouse button to pivot around that object. And to focus on object, of course, we want to select it and press the F key just like beforehand. Before we move on, let's briefly go over the viewport controls. So we know the different ways that we can view our world. So up here we have perspective. Let's say if you want a top-down bird's eye view, then we can click on the perspective button and select top like this. So to control in an orthographic view mode, you want to hold down the right mouse button to pan, and of course use a scroll wheel to zoom in and out. So right mouse button pan, scroll wheel to zoom in and out. We can also view it from the side, like maybe the left side, same controls. And of course, if we want to go back into perspective, we come up here, select the button, and click on perspective. Notice how a lot of the buttons in Unreal have a shortcut right next to it. For example, perspective shortcut is Alt and G. So instead of coming all the way up here and selecting perspective in the dropdown, I can just press the Alt and G key at the same time to go back into perspective. So right next to perspective is our view modes. So view modes are pretty great because they allow us to see our world in different ways. For example, maybe we don't want to see all the lights and we just want to see the colors of our world. Instead of coming up to lit, I can select unlit right there, or I can even select wireframe to see our world's edges and vertices. We will be changing our view modes a lot since it's a great way to debug our scene and see if there's anything wrong. So I'm going to come back up here to lit, or the shortcuts are Alt 4 for lit, Alt 3 for unlit, and Alt 2 for wireframe. So let's jump back with Alt and 4 to get our default view. And right next to our view modes is the show flags. So show flags allow us to turn on and off different object types. For example, what if I don't want this grid right here at the bottom? Then I can come to show, let's go find where grid is, and uncheck that to hide the grid. Now, maybe for some reason you don't want to show our static meshes, and essentially static meshes are all the objects you see right here. Then within the show flags, we can uncheck static meshes, and we no longer see those static meshes. Now, obviously we don't want that, and if you ever mess up your show flags, you can bring back the default flags by clicking on Use Defaults. And keep in mind that we aren't deleting anything with show flags, they just help us see what we want in the viewport. And finally, this is my favorite viewport option, and that is Game View. So if we come up here and click on the button with the 3 lines, we have Game View all the way down here, and we can see that the shortcut is G. Now, if I enable Game View, we're going to see exactly what the player will see in game. So if I press G to untoggle Game View, we're going to have Game View all the way down here, and we can see that the shortcut is G. Now, if I enable Game View, we're going to see exactly what the player will see in game. So if I press G to untoggle Game View, we can see that we have all these different widgets, and we have the grid right here. And of course, the player won't see the sun widget right here, which controls the sun's rotation. Instead, if we want to see exactly what the game will see, we click on G to hide all those widgets and features that are here for us, the editor. So just know that throughout this tutorial, when you see a bunch of widgets and these widgets just disappear, that's because I toggled on Game View with the G key. Now that we know how to navigate around our world, it's time to go over how to create new objects and move them around. So we're going to go over moving, scaling, and rotating objects. To begin, let's go over simple movement. I'm going to press a G key to get rid of our editor widgets, and now all we see is our world. So to move an object, simply select it, and by default we get the translation or the movement gizmo. To move an object, hover over any of these arrows and hold down the left mouse button. So I'm able to move this chair around, but notice how moving the chair isn't smooth. That's because by default, snapping is turned on. Now you could turn off snapping by coming up here and unchecking the grid icon like that. So now we can smoothly move our objects around. Now I'm going to turn it back on because it's important to know that Unreal uses centimeters. So right now, since there's a 10 right next to the icon, it's snapping every 10 centimeters. We can change this by selecting the number, and in the dropdown, let's select 100. So now it's moving every 100 centimeters, which is 1 meter. So every time this chair moves, it moves 1 meter. So that's pretty important to know. Now I'm going to uncheck it because I do want smooth movement. Next up is rotation. So to rotate your object, you want to change its gizmo. To change a gizmo, you want to select one of the buttons up here. So right now it's on translation. Right next to it is rotation. Now I can rotate this chair in all these different axes. We can see that rotation snapping is turned on. If I want to turn that off, then right next to translation snapping, we have this icon right here. Make sure it's not blue. And now we're no longer snapping every 10 degrees. I can press Ctrl Z to undo all those changes. And let's go over scaling. So right next to rotation, we have scaling, and scaling Journaling works pretty similar to the rest of the gizmos. All you have to do is hover over any of these squares, hold down the left mouse button, and now we're going to scale in that exact direction. So if we want to turn off scale snapping, of course, just uncheck the icon right there, and now we can smoothly scale. I'm going to press Ctrl Z a bit, because it's important to point out that if I hover my mouse not over one of the individual squares, but the one square that's connecting all of them, so the one in the middle, hold down the left mouse button, I can move my chair and scale it uniformly up and down, so not in any particular axis. So I press Ctrl Z to undo all those. And if we hover over all these buttons, we see that there's shortcuts. So movement is W, rotation is E, and scaling is R. So that means it's W to move, E to rotate, and R to scale. So those are some of the most common shortcuts that we're going to be using consistently throughout our time in Unreal Engine. So again, one last time, it is W to move, E to rotate, and R to scale. I also want to point out that if we want to move our object in the direction of our object, then come up to this little globe icon, select it. That's how it's now a square. And we can see that we're now able to move the object in that object's direction. So move it locally instead of globally. If we want to switch it back to global, then click the square icon again, locally instead of globally. If we want to switch it back to global, then click the square icon again to make it a globe. And now we're moving it in the direction of the world and not that individual object. It's also important to point out that if I press W to get our translation widget, and if I hover over the square that's in between the different axes, I'm able to lock it and move it only in those two axes. So if I hover in between the Y and X axis, I'm just moving it in between those and not in the Z axis. I can also lock it in between the Z and Y axis, just like this. So let's press Ctrl and Z to undo those changes. Now your and X axis, I'm able to lock it and move it only in those two axes. So if I hover in between the Y and X axis, I'm just moving it in between those and not in the Z axis. I can also lock it in between the Z and Y axis, just like this. So let's press Ctrl and Z to undo those changes. Now you're probably wondering, how do we create an object in our world? Well, there's a couple ways. Number one is that we can duplicate an object. So with any object selected, for example, this statue, if I press Ctrl and D, then we just duplicate that object. Now, we didn't notice a change. That's because it duplicated it in the same spot as the original object. So if I hold down the left mouse button and move it out of the way, we can see that we did duplicate that object. And within the outliner, there's now a new object called Statue 2, which is a copy of the original statue. So let's delete Statue 2. And there is an easier way to duplicate. And this is the way I duplicate. And that is hovering over an arrow with a translation widget selected and holding down Alt and left mouse button. So hold down both of those and simply drag. And now we're able to easily duplicate and drag an object away. So let's press Ctrl Z to undo all those changes. Now, another way to create an object is by using the Add tool up here in the toolbar. So for example, let's click on Add and let's come all the way down here to Shapes. And maybe we want to drag in a sphere. So we drag it in like this, or we can even add in a light, like a point light, and we're able to drag it around in our scene. So let's go delete those. And finally, the last way to add an object is through the content browser. So let's bring up the browser by holding down Control and Space at the same time, pressing both of those. And let's go into props and to add an object into a content browser, hold down the left mouse button and drag it into your world. For example, this couch. So let's go move it down just like this. And now we have a brand new object. So by holding down Shift, you can select multiple objects. So for example, if I have my chair on the left selected and I want to select a chair on the right, if I hold down Shift, now I have them both selected. If I hold down Shift again, I can add in the table and the statue. Now, if I want to deselect an item, all I have to do is hold down Control and click on any items to deselect them. Now all we have is the statue and the left chair selected. And here's another tip. If I have the chair selected, hold down Alt and the left mouse button to drag out a new chair. Let's say if I want to drag this chair all the way over there, then I'm going to have to drag it across the screen, move my camera, drag it across my screen again, and it's just a huge hassle. Another way I can do it is by holding down the Shift while I'm dragging. So if I'm going to hold down the left mouse button on one of these arrows, and I want to lock my camera to the object, simply hold down Shift and you're able to lock a camera to an object, which can save on a lot of time. So I'm going to press delete, and let's create a very, very simple scene just to get a hang of all the controls. So to begin, I want to hold down Shift, and let's select these two chairs, hold down Alt, and duplicate them out. So let go, hold down Alt and left mouse button again, Alt and left mouse button again. Now let's go rotate some of these chairs. That's how they're facing inwards. So select a chair, press E to get the rotation gizmo up, and have them all face inside. Just like this. Again, it doesn't have to be pretty perfect because we're just trying to get used to the controls at this point. And then I'm going to select the table, press R to scale it, and I want to elongate the table just a little bit, maybe even its x-axis. Press E again. Let's rotate this. Press W, move it into the middle right there. Select the chair, hold down Shift. Let's select the other chair and move them all in. Let's select the statue, move it into the middle. Press R, scale this up, and maybe add some lamps on both sides of the table. So press Control and space. Within our content, starter content, and props, we have this SM_lamp ceiling. If I drag it in, this is exactly what I want, but right now it's in the opposite direction. So I want this to be placed on the ground. I can press E, rotate this, and try to get to 180 degrees, or I can press Control Z and re-enable snapping for rotation right here, and rotate it exactly -180 degrees, which is what I want. So press W, and let's move it. That's how it's directly placed against the ground, like right here. So I could try to guess exactly where it is, or I could snap any object I have selected to the object that's directly below it by pressing the end key. So that's END, not the end letter. So press END, end, and snap it there just like that. So press R again, scale this up in the Z-axis, end, and snap it there, just END, not the end letter. So press END, end, and snap it there just like that. So press R again, scale this up in the Z-axis, hold down Alt, and drag it in both the Y and X axis right there like this. Let's hold down Shift again and drag both of those across our world just like that. And I would say congratulations, you now have a very, very simple level. This is definitely not the best map, but it is pretty good as a first level. Now that you finished your first level, it's time to move on to the post-process volume. So we're going to go over how we can change the settings of our viewport camera, specifically exposure. While in the process of creating our first level, you might have noticed that if we zoom